The fluorescent lights of the subway station flickered overhead as commuters hurried past without a second glance at the figure hunched in the corner. Thomas Mitchell sat with his back against the cold tile wall, his weathered hands wrapped around a worn paper cup that held a few coins. His beard had grown wild and gray, his clothes were several sizes too large, and the smell of the streets clung to him like a second skin. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another homeless veteran who had fallen through the cracks of society. The truth was far more complex. 3 months ago, Marine General Thomas Mitchell had been commanding respect in Pentagon briefing rooms and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Now he was conducting the most important mission of his career. Though nobody around him knew it, the operation had started when his daughter Sarah, a social worker, had been found dead in an alley just 6 blocks from this very station. The police had written it off as a drug deal gone wrong, but Thomas knew better. Sarah had been working to expose a human trafficking ring that operated through the city's underground, using the subway system to move victims. Her last phone call to him had been filled with fear, saying she was close to uncovering something big. When the investigation stalled and the case went cold, Thomas made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He resigned his commission, liquidated his assets, and disappeared into the streets. His plan was simple but dangerous: become invisible, blend in with the forgotten population, and find the truth that had died with his daughter. The subway platform buzzed with the usual evening rush. Business people checked their phones, teenagers laughed loudly, and elderly passengers clutched their belongings tighter. None of them paid attention to the homeless man who watched, everything with the trained eyes of someone who had spent decades studying human behavior and identifying threats. Thomas had learned more in 3 months on the streets than years of intelligence reports could have taught him. He knew which corners the dealers used, which tunnels the gangs claimed, and which stations served as meeting points for activities that happened in the shadows. Most importantly, he had started to piece together the network that he believed had killed Sarah. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his concentration. 3 young men were walking toward him, their swagger and coordinated movement immediately setting off alarm bells in his mind. Thomas had seen this type before in war zones and rough neighborhoods around the world. They moved like a pack, feeding off each other's aggression and looking for easy prey. The leader was tall and lean, probably in his early 20s, with tattoos covering his neck and arms. His 2 companions flanked him slightly, their hands already moving toward their pockets. Thomas recognized the setup immediately. They had picked him because he looked vulnerable, alone, and unlikely to fight back. As they got closer, Thomas could hear fragments of their conversation. They were talking about money they needed quickly, about someone who would be angry if they came back empty-handed. These weren't random thugs looking for lunch money. They were working for someone, and that someone had expectations. Thomas remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled and his muscles relaxed despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through his system. 30 years of military training had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond with appropriate force. But this situation required more finesse than a battlefield. He needed these men to reveal information, not just neutralize them. The leader stopped directly in front of him, his shadow falling across Thomas's face. The other 2 positioned themselves to block any escape routes, though they probably didn't realize that the man they were threatening had memorized every exit, security camera, and potential weapon within a 50-foot radius. "Hey, old man," the leader said, his voice carrying the false confidence of someone trying to impress his friends. "You're sitting in our spot. We're gonna need you to pay rent." Thomas looked up slowly, making sure to appear confused and frightened. His performance was flawless, drawing on observations of genuinely vulnerable people he had met during his time on the streets. Inside, however, his mind was already calculating distances, analyzing the attackers' stances, and preparing for multiple scenarios. The station around them continued its normal rhythm. People walked by, deliberately avoiding eye contact with the scene unfolding in the corner. Thomas understood their reluctance to get involved, but it also meant he was truly on his own, just the way he preferred it for what was about to happen. The second attacker, shorter but stockier than his leader, cracked his knuckles and stepped forward. "You deaf old man? Tony asked you a question. This is our territory and you owe us for squatting here." Thomas let his shoulders shake slightly as if from fear or withdrawal. His voice came out as a raspy whisper when he finally spoke. I don't have much. Just a few dollars for food. Please, I'll move somewhere else. Tony, the leader, laughed and nudged his companions. Listen to this guy. Please, I'll move. You think this is a hotel where you can just check out when you want? He crouched down, bringing his face closer to Thomas's. See, we've been watching you. You've been here for weeks collecting money from people. That makes you a business, and businesses pay protection. What Tony didn't realize was that Thomas had indeed been watching the station for weeks, but not for the reasons they imagined. He had identified this location as a key transit point for the trafficking operation. Young women would arrive here looking lost and frightened, only to be met by seemingly helpful individuals who would guide them toward train lines that led to parts of the city where people disappeared. Thomas had documented patterns, taken mental photographs of faces, and slowly built a network of informants among the truly homeless population. They trusted him because he shared their struggles, never knowing that he was gathering intelligence with the same methodical precision he had once used to hunt terrorists in foreign countries. The third attacker, barely 18 and clearly nervous about the whole situation, kept glancing around the station. Maybe we should just take whatever he's got and go, Tony. There are cameras everywhere. Tony's expression hardened. Jimmy, you questioning me? I told you, this is about respect. Every bum in this system needs to know that we run things down here. He turned back to Thomas. Empty your pockets, old man, everything. And next time we see you here, you better have our 20% ready. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. His fingers brushed against items that would have shocked his attackers. A military-grade tactical knife, a small device that could jam cellular signals, and a GPS tracker that would lead authorities to wherever his body ended up if things went wrong. But he pulled out only a crumpled $5 bill and a handful of change. This is all I have, he said, holding the money out with a trembling hand. I haven't eaten since yesterday. Tony snatched the money and stood up, his face showing disgust. $5? That's insulting. He nodded to his companions. Teach him about proper business etiquette. The stocky one moved first, reaching down to grab Thomas by the shirt. This was the moment Thomas had been waiting for, though not for the reasons his attackers would understand. He needed them to escalate the situation just enough to justify his response. But more importantly, he needed to see how far they were willing to go. Their methods and their confidence level would tell him who they worked for. As hands reached for him, Thomas made a calculation. These weren't the people who had killed Sarah, but they were part of the same ecosystem. They might have information, or they might lead him to someone who did. Either way, he needed to control this situation carefully. Thomas allowed himself to be pulled to his feet, stumbling slightly as if weak from hunger. The movement brought him closer to his attackers, close enough to smell the alcohol on their breath and see the poor decision-making in their eyes. These were small-time criminals trying to act bigger than they were, which made them both dangerous and potentially useful. Please, Thomas whispered again, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear if they were paying attention. I'm just trying to survive. Tony stepped back and watched as his two companions positioned Thomas between them. Survival costs money, old man, and you're about to learn what happens when you don't pay your debts in our neighborhood. The platform around them continued to bustle with evening commuters, but Thomas noticed something interesting. A woman in a business suit had stopped near the ticket machines and was watching their interaction, while pretending to study the subway map. Her posture and the way she held her purse suggested she was considering intervening, but social conditioning and personal safety concerns kept her frozen in place. Thomas filed this information away. If she was the type to get involved, she might also be the type to report what she saw. That could be useful later, depending on how the next few minutes played out. For now, though, he needed to focus on his immediate situation and the three young men who had no idea they were about to encounter someone who had been trained to handle much worse threats than they could possibly imagine. The stocky attacker grabbed Thomas's left arm while Jimmy moved to his right side. Tony stood back, clearly enjoying his role as the orchestrator of what he believed would be a simple lesson in street hierarchy. What none of them realized was that Thomas had allowed them to position him exactly where he wanted to be. Here's how this works, Tony continued, his voice growing louder and more confident. Every week you give us 20% of whatever you collect. Miss a payment and we take it out of your hide. Cause trouble, and we make sure you find a new place to sleep. Permanently. Thomas kept his head down, but his peripheral vision tracked every movement around him. The woman by the ticket machines was now talking quietly into her phone. A security guard had appeared at the far end of the platform, though he seemed more interested in his clipboard than the confrontation developing in front of him. Most importantly, Thomas noted the arrival of the next train was still 8 minutes away, giving him a controlled time frame to work within. Jimmy, the nervous one, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Tony, maybe we should wrap this up. That guard is getting closer." "Relax," Tony snapped. "Security doesn't care about bums. They got real criminals to worry about." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small knife, not much bigger than a pocket knife but sharp enough to make his point. "Now, old man, let's talk about what you're going to do to make up for today's disrespect." The appearance of the weapon changed everything for Thomas. These weren't just bullies shaking down someone they perceived as helpless. They were armed individuals willing to threaten deadly force for a few dollars. More importantly, their casual use of weapons suggested they were part of something larger than random street crime. Thomas raised his head slightly, meeting Tony's eyes for the first time. What Tony saw there should have been a warning, but he was too caught up in his own performance to recognize danger when it looked back at him. For just a moment, Thomas let his true nature show through the homeless disguise. It was the look of someone who had faced down enemy combatants in places where hesitation meant death. "You're making a mistake," Thomas said quietly, his voice losing some of its earlier tremor. Tony laughed. "Oh, now he's got something to say. What kind of mistake am I making, old man? Thinking you've got more money hidden somewhere?" The stocky attacker tightened his grip on Thomas's arm. "Want me to check his other pockets, Tony? Maybe he's got a wallet tucked away somewhere." Thomas allowed them to maintain their hold while he assessed the situation one final time. These three had crossed lines that meant they were legitimate threats, not just misguided young men. The knife, the coordinated approach, and their familiarity with controlling territory all pointed to organized criminal activity. Most importantly, their confidence suggested they had done this before and gotten away with it. "The mistake you're making," Thomas continued in the same quiet voice, "is assuming I'm helpless for the first time." Uncertainty flickered across Tony's face. Something about the older man's tone didn't match his appearance or situation, but pride and the presence of his companions prevented him from backing down. Instead, he stepped closer, bringing the knife within inches of Thomas's chest. "Old man, I think maybe you don't understand your situation here. You're outnumbered, you're weak, and nobody cares what happens to you. So why don't you shut up and let us finish our business?" Thomas nodded slowly, as if accepting the inevitable. "You're right about one thing. Nobody cares what happens to me." His eyes moved deliberately to each of his attackers. "But you should be more worried about what happens to you." The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. Thomas's right hand moved with practiced precision, striking a pressure point on the stocky attacker's wrist that caused him to release his grip immediately. In the same motion, Thomas pivoted slightly, using his body weight and leverage to throw Jimmy off balance and send him stumbling backward into a support pillar. Tony had perhaps 2 seconds to register that his easy victim had become something entirely different before. Thomas's left hand closed around his wrist, the one holding the knife. The grip was precise and unbreakable, applying pressure to nerves and bones in a way that made Tony's fingers go numb instantly. The knife clattered to the platform floor as Thomas stepped forward, still maintaining his hold on Tony's wrist, while positioning himself between all three attackers. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like the homeless man had simply moved awkwardly during a struggle. But up close, the three young men were beginning to understand that they had made a serious error in judgment. "Now," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "we're going to have a different kind of conversation." The change in Thomas was so complete that for a moment, the three attackers stood frozen in confusion. The trembling, frightened homeless man had vanished, replaced by someone whose every movement radiated controlled violence and absolute confidence. Tony tried to pull his wrist free, but the grip holding him felt like it could crush bone without effort. "What the hell?" Jimmy stammered, pushing himself away from the pillar where he had stumbled. His eyes darted between Thomas and the exits, clearly calculating whether he could run fast enough to escape whatever was happening. Thomas maintained his hold on Tony, while keeping the other two in his peripheral vision. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to answer my questions honestly and completely. Lie to me, and things will become very unpleasant very quickly." The stocky attacker was flexing his fingers, trying to restore feeling to his hand. You're crazy if you think we're scared of some old bum. There are 3 of us and 1 of you. Thomas smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Son, I've been outnumbered by better men than you in places that would give you nightmares. Numbers only matter if you know how to use them. He applied slightly more pressure to Tony's wrist, causing the young man to wince and rise up on his toes. Now, who do you work for? Tony tried to maintain his defiance despite the pain shooting up his arm. I don't work for nobody. This is our territory, and we don't answer to anyone. The answer told Thomas what he needed to know. These weren't independent operators. The phrasing, the defensive posture, and the way Tony's companions looked to him for guidance all suggested a larger organization. Small-time criminals claimed territory. Professionals claimed business relationships. Wrong answer, Thomas said calmly. He shifted his grip slightly, and Tony gasped as new pressure points were activated. Let me rephrase the question. Who gives you permission to operate in this station? Jimmy was edging toward the staircase, but Thomas caught the movement without turning his head. I wouldn't recommend running. That would make me think you have something important to hide, and I'd have to track you down later. Much better to settle this now. The casual confidence in Thomas's voice stopped Jimmy in his tracks. There was something in the older man's tone that suggested running would only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. The stocky attacker took a step forward, trying to help his leader. Look, mister, maybe we can work something out. We didn't know you were whatever you are. Why don't we just call this even and everybody walks away? Thomas kept his eyes on Tony while addressing the question. That's not how this works. You threatened me with a weapon and attempted to extort money. In some places, that's enough to justify a permanent solution. He paused, letting the implications sink in. But I'm not interested in hurting you. I'm interested in information. Around them, the subway station continued its evening routine, but Thomas noticed that more people were giving their corner a wide berth. The woman with the phone had moved closer to the security guard, who was now walking in their direction, though still maintaining a careful distance. Tony's face was pale with pain, but he was beginning to understand that cooperation might be his best option. What kind of information? Better, Thomas said approvingly. Tell me about the girls. The question hit its mark immediately. All 3 attackers tensed, and Thomas saw recognition flash across their faces. They knew exactly what he was talking about, which meant they were connected to the trafficking operation he had been tracking. What girls? Tony asked, but his voice lacked conviction. Thomas increased the pressure on his wrist again. The young women who pass through this station, lost, frightened, looking for help. Someone meets them here and guides them to trains that take them places they never come back from. Tell me about that operation. Jimmy and the stocky attacker exchanged glances, and Thomas could see they were communicating silently. They were weighing their options, trying to decide whether loyalty to their organization was worth the immediate pain and potential consequences of defying someone who clearly wasn't what he appeared to be. We don't know anything about girls, the stocky one said, but his body language contradicted his words. He was standing differently now, more alert, as if preparing for a fight or flight response. Thomas sighed. Gentlemen, I've spent 30 years learning to read people. Your friend here, he nodded toward Tony, has a tell when he lies. His left eye twitches. The nervous one, he glanced at Jimmy, touches his collar when he's uncomfortable with a topic. And you, he looked directly at the stocky attacker, clench your jaw when you're trying to decide whether to tell the truth. The accuracy of his observations clearly unsettled all 3 men. Thomas continued. Right now, all 3 of you are displaying every sign of people who know exactly what I'm talking about, but are afraid to admit it. That suggests the people you work for have made very serious threats about what happens to anyone who talks. He released Tony's wrist suddenly, causing the young man to stagger backward. But instead of trying to escape, Tony remained where he was, flexing his fingers and watching Thomas with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Here's what I think, Thomas said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than his earlier threats. I think you 3 are small-time operators who occasionally provide services for a much larger organization. You collect debts, intimidate witnesses, maybe recruit vulnerable people, but you're not important enough to know the big picture, which means you're expendable if something goes wrong. The security guard was now close enough that Thomas could hear his radio crackling with static. The approaching footsteps represented both an opportunity and a complication. Official involvement could provide protection and legitimacy to his investigation, but it could also blow his cover and end months of careful infiltration work. Thomas made a quick decision. "Officer," he called out before the guard could speak, his voice returning to the frightened tremor of his homeless persona. "Thank goodness you're here. These young men were just helping me up after I fell." The guard, a middle-aged man with the tired expression of someone who had seen too much, looked skeptically at the scene. Tony was still flexing his wrist. Jimmy was pressed against the wall, looking pale, and the stocky attacker was breathing heavily. "None of them looked like good Samaritans helping an elderly homeless man, is that right?" the guard asked, his hand resting casually on his radio. "Ma'am over there said she saw some kind of altercation." Tony opened his mouth to speak, but Thomas caught his eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly. The slight movement carried an unmistakable message. Any attempt to involve the authorities would have consequences that extended far beyond this moment. "Just a misunderstanding, officer," Tony said carefully. "We were trying to help, but I think we scared him by accident." The guard wasn't buying it, but dealing with homeless complaints wasn't high on his priority list unless someone was actually hurt or property was damaged. "You boys need to move along. This isn't a place to hang around." "Absolutely, officer," Jimmy said quickly, clearly eager to escape the situation. "We were just leaving." Thomas watched the exchange with interest. The fact that Tony hadn't immediately tried to get him arrested or accused him of assault suggested that his earlier assessment was correct. These three were involved in activities that couldn't bear official scrutiny. As the guard moved away, seemingly satisfied that the immediate situation was resolved, Thomas turned back to his captive audience. The dynamic had shifted now that they all understood he could have easily gotten them in serious trouble with law enforcement, but had chosen not to. "Now that we have some privacy again," Thomas said quietly, "let's return to our conversation. You were about to tell me about the trafficking operation that runs through this station." The stocky attacker looked around nervously. "Man, you don't understand what you're asking. The people we're talking about, they don't just hurt you if you cross them. They make people disappear completely." Thomas felt a cold anger settling in his chest. This was the closest he had come to direct confirmation that Sarah had been killed by an organized network, rather than random street crime. "Tell me about these people who make others disappear." Jimmy wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool underground air. "Look, we just do small jobs, okay? Someone calls, gives us an address or a description, tells us to lean on somebody or collect something. We don't ask questions about the big picture." "But you've seen things," Thomas pressed. "You've noticed patterns. Young women arriving at this station looking lost or scared. Someone approaching them offering help, guiding them toward specific train lines. You've seen it happen." Tony was massaging his wrist, but his expression had grown thoughtful. "Maybe we've seen some things. But talking about it, that's not just dangerous for us. That's dangerous for everyone we know." Thomas recognized the fear in their voices, and it wasn't fear of him anymore. These three had genuinely terrified of their employers, which meant the organization was both large enough and ruthless enough to enforce absolute silence among its lower-level operatives. "What if I told you," Thomas said slowly, "that I might be able to offer protection? That cooperation with me could lead to the kind of changes that would make these people who scare you so much irrelevant." The three attackers exchanged glances again, but this time Thomas could see a different kind of communication passing between them. It was the look of people who had been trapped in a bad situation for a long time and were being offered a possible way out. "Protection from who?" the stocky attacker asked. "You're homeless. What kind of protection could you possibly offer?" Thomas smiled grimly. "That's where you're wrong about me. I'm not actually homeless. I'm undercover." The admission hung in the air like a live wire. Tony's eyes widened as he began to process the implications. "Undercover? Like police undercover?" "Something like that," Thomas replied, allowing them to draw their own conclusions. "Which means that everything you tell me right now could be the beginning of the end for the people who have been threatening you." Jimmy pushed away from the wall, his nervous energy suddenly focused. "Are you serious?" "You're actually a cop." Thomas didn't correct the assumption. His background was more complex than they could understand, but the important thing was establishing credibility and leverage. "I'm serious about bringing down the organization that's been using this station as a hub for human trafficking. And I'm serious about protecting people who help me do it." The stocky attacker looked around the platform again, as if expecting their employers to materialize from the shadows. "If we talk to you and you're not who you say you are, we're dead. All of us. If you don't talk to me, Thomas countered, how many more girls are going to disappear through this station? How long before the operation expands and you become more than just small-time muscle? How long before you cross a line that there's no coming back from? The questions hit their mark because Thomas could see in their faces that they had already been struggling with these same concerns. They weren't hardened criminals. They were young men who had gotten involved in something that had grown beyond their control or understanding. Tony made the decision for all of them. Okay, but not here. Too many people, too many cameras. If we're going to do this, it has to be somewhere safe. 2 hours later, Thomas sat across from Tony in an all-night diner 6 blocks from the subway station. The fluorescent lighting was harsh and unflattering, but it provided the kind of public anonymity that made both men feel safer. Jimmy and the stocky attacker, whose name Thomas had learned was Marcus, sat in a booth nearby, keeping watch for anyone who might be following them. The transformation in the 3 young men had been remarkable. Away from the need to project strength and intimidation, they looked like what they really were: scared kids who had gotten in over their heads. Tony, in particular, seemed eager to unburden himself of information he had been carrying for months. It started about a year ago, Tony began, stirring sugar into his coffee with nervous energy. We were just running numbers for some guys in the neighborhood. Small stuff, nothing serious. Then this woman approached us with a different kind of job. Thomas kept his expression neutral, but internally he was cataloging every detail. What kind of woman? Professional. Expensive clothes, spoke like she had education. She said she represented people who could offer us better opportunities if we proved we could handle responsibility. Tony glanced around the diner before continuing. The first jobs were simple. Go to specific locations. Look for girls who seemed lost or new to the city. Strike up conversations. The description made Thomas's blood run cold, but he forced himself to remain calm. What were you supposed to do after you talked to them? Marcus leaned forward from the adjacent booth. At first, we thought we were helping them. We'd tell them about places they could stay, people who could help them find work. It seemed like social work, you know? But then you started noticing things, Thomas prompted. Jimmy nodded. Girls we talked to would disappear. Not just leave the area, but vanish completely. And when we asked our contact about it, she said they had been placed in good situations and didn't need to worry about the streets anymore. Thomas pulled out a small notebook, the kind any homeless person might use to keep track of important information. Tell me about this contact. Name, description, how she reached you. She called herself Ms. Chen, Tony said. Asian woman, maybe 40, always wore business suits. She had this way of talking that made everything sound legitimate, even when you knew it probably wasn't. The name meant nothing to Thomas, but he wrote it down anyway. How did she contact you for jobs? Burner phones, Marcus replied. She'd text an address and a description. Sometimes it was the subway station, sometimes the bus terminal, sometimes places like women's shelters or social services offices. Thomas felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fit together. She was targeting vulnerable women who were already in the system, people who might not be missed immediately. That's what we started thinking, Tony agreed, especially after we saw some of the same girls' pictures on missing person flyers weeks later. The confirmation hit Thomas like a physical blow. These 3 had been unwitting, recruiters for the same organization that had killed Sarah. They had been the friendly faces that convinced desperate women to trust the wrong people. How many girls do you think you recruited? Thomas asked quietly. The 3 men exchanged looks and Thomas could see the weight of realization settling on them. They had been telling themselves they were helping people, but now they were being forced to confront the truth. Maybe 20 or 30 over the past year, Jimmy whispered. God, we didn't know. We really didn't know what was happening to them. Thomas believed them, which made what he had to tell them even more difficult. One of those women was my daughter. The words fell into silence that seemed to stretch forever. Tony's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips, Marcus went pale, and Jimmy actually pushed back from the table as if trying to distance himself from the revelation. Your daughter? Tony finally managed to say. Thomas pulled out his wallet and removed a photograph of Sarah. It was a professional headshot from her social work credentials, showing a young woman with kind eyes and her father's determined chin. He placed it on the table where all 3 could see it. Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, social worker. She was investigating the trafficking network when she was killed 3 months ago. The police think it was a random crime, but I know better. Marcus was staring at the photograph with growing horror. We only talked to girls who looked like they needed help. We didn't recruit anyone for that. You may not have intended to, Thomas said gently. But that's exactly what you did. You were the first contact, the friendly face that made them trust the organization. After that, other people took over. Tony pushed the photograph back toward Thomas with a shaking hand. We didn't know, man. I swear we didn't know what we were really doing. Thomas carefully returned Sarah's picture to his wallet. I believe you. But now you do know, and that means you have a choice to make. You can walk away and pretend this conversation never happened. Or you can help me bring down the people who killed my daughter and all those other women. The three young men sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they had learned. Thomas could see them struggling with guilt, fear, and the realization that their actions had contributed to something monstrous. If we help you, Jimmy said finally, what happens to us? We're accessories to kidnapping and murder. Thomas had been expecting this question. That depends on how much help you provide and how committed you are to making things right. Information that leads to arrests and convictions can go a long way toward redemption. And if we don't help? Marcus asked. Thomas met his eyes directly. Then I find another way to get the information I need, and you three continue to live with the knowledge of what you've done. But the organization you work for will eventually dispose of you anyway. People like Ms. Chen don't keep loose ends around indefinitely. 6 weeks later, Thomas stood in a federal courthouse wearing a properly fitted suit for the first time in months. His beard was trimmed, his hair was clean, and the transformation back to his true identity was complete. But the man who had emerged from the streets was different from the Marine general who had entered them months earlier. The operation that followed his conversation with Tony, Marcus and Jimmy, had been swift and devastating to the trafficking network. The three young men had provided detailed information about their contacts' methods and locations. More importantly, they had agreed to wear recording devices during subsequent meetings with Ms. Chen and her associates. The recordings had led to a series of coordinated raids across the city. 17 people had been arrested, including Ms. Chen, whose real name was Linda Zhang and who had been operating similar recruitment networks in 3 different states. Most importantly, they had rescued 8 women who were being held in various locations around the city. Thomas watched through the courtroom windows as reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. The story had captured national attention, partly because of the scope of the trafficking operation, but mostly because of the unusual circumstances that had led to its discovery. The media had latched onto the narrative of the homeless veteran who was actually an undercover Marine general, though they had gotten many of the details wrong. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who had taken over the official investigation once Thomas revealed his true identity, approached him with a final report. The last of the victims have been reunited with their families or placed in protective services. Ms. Chen and 4 of her associates will be facing federal trafficking charges. The 3 boys who helped us are being processed through a cooperation agreement. Thomas nodded, but his expression remained somber. Any word on who is above Ms. Chen in the organization? She's talking, but slowly. What we've learned so far suggests this was part of a much larger network with connections in at least 6 major cities. The FBI is coordinating with other jurisdictions to map the full scope. The news should have felt like victory, but Thomas found himself thinking about all the women who hadn't been saved. Sarah's case file still sat open on his desk at home, a reminder that justice for one part of the network didn't bring his daughter back. Tony appeared at his elbow, looking uncomfortable in the borrowed suit he wore for his court appearance. The young man had become the primary witness against the trafficking organization, and his testimony had been crucial in securing convictions. General Mitchell, I wanted to thank you again for giving us the chance to make this right. Thomas studied the young man's face. You made the choice to do the right thing, Tony. I just provided the opportunity. Still, Tony persisted. We know what we did was wrong, even if we didn't understand how wrong at the time. Having the chance to fix it, that means everything. Through the courthouse windows, Thomas could see Marcus and Jimmy talking to a victim's advocate. All 3 of the former recruiters were enrolled in community service programs and educational courses as part of their plea agreements. They would carry the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives, but they were also working to ensure that no one else would fall victim to similar schemes. Detective Rodriguez cleared her throat. General, there's something else. The department wants to offer you a consulting position with our human trafficking task force. Your experience and methods could be valuable for future operations. Thomas considered the offer. The work would be meaningful, and it would allow him to continue Sarah's fight against the networks that preyed on vulnerable people. But it would also mean acknowledging that the man who had entered the subway station as Thomas Mitchell, homeless veteran, could never fully return to being General Mitchell, military commander. "I'll need some time to consider it," he said finally. As the crowd began to disperse from the courthouse, Thomas found himself walking toward the subway station where everything had begun. The platform looked different now, though nothing physical had changed. The corner where he had spent weeks observing and gathering intelligence was occupied by a different homeless man, someone whose situation was genuinely what Thomas's had only appeared to be. Thomas approached the man and quietly placed a $100 bill in his cup, along with a card for a social services organization that had been verified as legitimate. It was a small gesture, but it represented something important about what he had learned during his time on the streets. The train arrived with its familiar rumble and screech of brakes. As Thomas boarded, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had entered the underground world seeking justice for his daughter and had found it, but he had also discovered something else. He had learned that the distance between those who have power and those who don't is often much smaller than it appears, and that understanding both sides of that divide was essential for protecting the vulnerable. The train pulled away from the station, carrying Thomas back toward the surface and whatever came next. Behind him, the underground continued its endless cycle of arrivals and departures, but now there were fewer predators waiting in the shadows for lost and frightened prey. In his pocket, Thomas carried a new mission statement he had written for himself: to use his position and experience to bridge the gap between those who enforced justice and those who needed it most. It wasn't the career he had planned, but it was the one his daughter would have wanted him to have. The subway attackers who had confronted a homeless man that evening had unknowingly set in motion events that dismantled an entire criminal network. Sometimes justice came from the most unexpected directions, delivered by people who appeared to be powerless, but who possessed strength that couldn't be seen until the moment it was needed most.